Hey everyone, it's Peter, and I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about stylistic development in Italian art, especially from the 13th into the 14th centuries. This is, I think, a particularly interesting period of transition. Some people will describe it as, late medieval, basically meaning, again, 12th, 13th, maybe in 14th centuries. Other people might describe it as proto-Renaissance, a kind of pre-Renaissance art style. In any case, it sets some really important precedents for the later development of art, not just in Italy, but throughout what we'll come to call Western Europe, an influence that extends as far to the West as you could take it basically out to the British Isles potentially, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on the Italian peninsula. Okay, so where do we begin? Let's take a quick look at the reason we put the Byzantine adjective into the descriptor. So let's keep going here. Okay, main thing we want to think about just a little bit is probably just a quick introduction to style, and that way the next slide will make a little bit more sense. When we talk about the Byzantine influence, we would talk about the use of wooden panels as a support for the paintings. These are intended to have a particularly prominent position in a Byzantine church, and you can see it even today in Eastern Orthodox, for instance, Greek or Russian Orthodox churches, a structure called an iconostasis, which is basically a screen that separates the congregation from the altar, and it's decorated with images. Icons are intended to be actively used in worship as a kind of conduit or channel to the spiritual being and the kind of presence that being offers to a worshiper. And you'll see a literal interaction, for instance, kneeling before an icon or kissing an icon in Eastern Orthodox practice. And this is, somewhat foreign to typical Western interactions with religious imagery. So panel painting, meaning it's portable, it's relatively modest in scale, it has a prominent position near the altar. Hieratic presentation refers to a certain sense of static, centrally presented figures, oftentimes with somewhat otherworldly expressions, clearly intended to give a sense of a kind of remote spiritual location rather than immediately present in the viewer's space. And kind of echoing this is a two-dimensional quality. It's very typical in icon painting, rarely a sense of real depth. We'll look at our examples in just a second to emphasize what that is all about. Oftentimes a copious amount of gold leaf enhancing a reflective aspect that is, adds, I think, considerably to the visual allure and presence in a church, especially prior to electric illumination, where you might have candles reflecting, for instance, off the surface. So this is where we get the sort of Byzantine part. The Italo aspect, is a kind of change of that style as it is adopted on the Italian peninsula. It's worth just keeping in mind in terms of dates and such that the sack of Constantinople by the Venetians in the beginning of the 13th century, in particular, in the Fourth Crusade, 1204, I think is the date I'm looking for, has a great deal to do with this adoption of the format and the style, because the objects literally would have been removed from Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, then distributed throughout Western Europe, in many cases going through Italy. So factors that we could describe as Italian include a less formal and remote characterization of the figures and their expressions within the picture. More interest in objects having mass and a deeper sense of relief, that is to say that they stand out more, which kind of leads to the next item, more interest in space. They're clearly more anecdotal. That is, they rely upon more everyday settings and narrative episodes, and kind of building on that vernacular. So it might be located specifically in a town or city in Italy. We might get a kind of sense of religious figures occupying our space and time. I might actually add in an interest in time, the timeless aspect of Byzantine, properly speaking, icons is certainly an important aspect, but the sense of time shifting and changing in Italian painting is significant. So here's a good example, a couple good examples. These are dating from the 6th into the 7th century, sort of pre the famous iconoclastic controversy in the 8th and 9th centuries in the Byzantine Empire, where a number of these paintings were actually destroyed. You can see, for instance, the image on the left, relatively modest scale, clearly the wood right here, the split through the possibly joined panels. That's often done when you paint on wood. The figures have this somewhat otherworldly expression, two-dimensionality, for instance, in terms of the feet and the way the figures are presented. There's certainly a sense of light coming across, but it's kept to a minimum. And of course, these beautiful golden halos and other gold leaf elements add to that, a kind of mystical aspect. This image of Christ, again, the same basic time frame, gives us an even clearer picture of the kind of, so to speak, clearer picture of the kind of image that a worshiper in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, might interact with in a very direct way. It's worth pointing out also that these icons are often repeated again and again and again, very similar poses, representations of figures and situations, creating a tradition. Part of the sort of feel or vibe, for want of a better term, is enhanced by the use of a medium called encaustic, which is basically melted wax with pigment added. So there's a certain sense of texture and solidity to these objects. In the Italian tradition, one of the earliest that we could describe as an Italo-Byzantine image would be this representation of St. Francis. This is an image that dates, and in fact, you can kind of see the date below it and the name of the artist, Bonaventura Berlinghieri, 1235. So Francis dies in 1226. It's a great representation straddling those two themes, where we have a very hieratic and somewhat severe, lengthy two-dimensional St. Francis showing his famous wounds of Christ in his hands, and most prominently, I think, featured also hands and then the feet. And that is, again, very much in the Byzantine mode. You have this really splendid shimmering gold background, again, would stand out really nicely in an altar area, which is where these would typically be hanging, or in this case, it's against the wall of a church. To the side, however, interesting departures as we begin to see a greater engagement with narrative, and particularly local narrative. So here he is receiving the stigmata. Here Francis is preaching to the birds at Bavania. Other miracles, healing crippled people, and the list goes on and presented in a relatively lively and, again, anecdotal fashion to the viewer. So you can simultaneously kind of focus on this central hieratic figure here, again, devoted to the cult, the image of St. Francis, but also take a little bit more local enjoyment with these narrative subjects. Again, 1235. As we move forward, and this is obviously a tricky thing to negotiate in Italian art history, to focus too much on the so-called progress of naturalism, but chronologically it does hold together to a certain degree. We see the artist Cimabue in his Virgin Enthroned, the so-called, described as the Maestà, M-E-E-S-T-A, the Maestà. And it's definitely working in both traditions. Copious amounts of gold leaf, a certain sense of two-dimensionality, and a little bit of, remoteness, I guess you could argue, in terms of the postures and expressions of the figures involved. But at the same time, a real building up, for instance, in the structure of the throne of the Virgin Mary, a sense of three-dimensionality, a kind of almost architectonic quality. And the sense of modeling, while undermined slightly by these thin gold striations, is nevertheless maintained elsewhere in both the image of the Virgin and in the angels and other figures, particularly these prophets below. So it's breaking away from that, in a sense, a very idealized and you might argue from a naturalistic standpoint, restricted format in art. If you look at as we continue this kind of narrative, we'll see the kind of last hurrah, if you will, in the Italo Byzantine style, and it's jettisoning in a very real sense by the likes of Giotto, who borrows, some of that hieratic feel with the centrality of the Virgin Mary, very kind of orderly. And this is typical for Giotto, a kind of very static and monumental arrangement of figures. Nevertheless, the sense of a real development of representation of light and space and mass is present. Light, for instance, falls across the Virgin's body. She has a sense of actual physical presence, and she communicates, I think, with the viewer, the sort of potential viewer, in a way that seems much more direct. She enters the viewer's space, and the viewer, by association, can enter her space. And there are, little things here which I talk about elsewhere, but particularly the cutting off of the heads of some of these, the faces, I should be more specific, of these figures that are looking on. Kind of incidental, anecdotal. These halos might change position, and a different part will be revealed, another part will be covered up, and so on and so forth. And the sense of light being represented in this is also particularly strong. So all in all, this is a fascinating development because it really sets the stage of borrowing from, adopting and adapting the Byzantine mode, including medium and format, but beginning to enlarge on it in this new naturalistic and in some cases really quite anecdotal, everyday, vernacular type of presentation.